Welcome to Windows on the World. We've got a very packed show tonight, and earlier on today I put out a little advert for the event on the 16th of June, one of many events we're going to be doing over the summer. This one is at the King Arthur pub in Glastonbury. There's going to be 3 speakers, myself, Piers Corbin and Sandy Adams, and we're going to cover the very big picture, the picture that we talk about in quite a lot of depth every week, and the picture that more and more people are actually talking to us about. And what's very interesting is that we are now getting people from not just this country, but Northern Ireland, people in Sweden, there's people obviously in America, there's people in, well, let's put it this way, many other countries. Been contacted a lot over the past few months, so the word is getting out there, and we're going to be talking about Technocracy tonight, this actual surveillance grid that's been put in place. We've touched upon it a lot over the last few weeks, and also the way that it's imposed. The way it's imposed is actually through psychological nudging, and we're going to go into that tonight because it's such a massive area, and I've found some astonishing things. Whenever I look at this stuff on the internet, I kind of wonder why it is that nobody else is talking about it to the extent that we are, because the actual re-engineering of society is the biggest thing that's happening. There is nothing more important than this, and we'll be covering all of this and more in our talk on the 16th, and we're going to be doing several events over the summer. I'll keep you updated on those. Last year we had some great successes with the festivals we went to, and what was very encouraging was that people all over the place knew about the show and were actually getting involved in doing things. And I get sent a lot of stuff now. I mean, I think we've talked about this over the past few weeks, but I'm very grateful for it, and thanks to Ed in Northern Ireland who phoned up earlier on today, and we've had several people contacting us from Northern Ireland. We're going to get onto that a bit later in the show, because the surveillance and control grid is being imposed rather rapidly there. So let's just start with something that Aldous Huxley said. Now, of course, he wrote Brave New World, and we use quite a few of his quotes because he foresaw the technocracy, the forthcoming revolution, which would be a quiet revolution using silent weapons of war, basically psychology. And one of the most influential books on psychology that I've ever read is by Martin L. Gross, and it's called The Psychological Society. Came out in around 1979, I think, and it covers this area of psychology. And people think psychology is just, well, what's that? Sigmund Freud? No, it's a movement. It's an actual technological movement, and there are people using psychology in every single part of our lives. And this is the very strange thing about it, in that nothing is actually real anymore, in the respect that what we get is propaganda from the Department of Propaganda. Well, it could be the government, or it could be the corporatocracy that run the government, or it could be any number of organisations that are linked into either of those. And of course, psychology and nudging through think tanks, we've been going on about this for such a long time, and we did stuff on the Tavistock Institute several years ago, and the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is in Whitecross Street in London, EC1. You can see a thing I did a couple of years ago with somebody who works with Anthony J. Hilda. Bill came over as a cameraman, and we did some filming there around that area, and it was Tavistock and their influence on the psychological nudging and the change agents within society. These people we talk about all the time, or we like to call them useful idiots. And this goes into everything, as I said earlier on. It goes into all of the infinite things that affect us, and it all comes down to technocracy, this idea that we can be controlled, and it's ultimately going to end up in artificial intelligence. Well, we're on the way to that. And of course, the 5G rollout is particularly disturbing because the data mapping is going to be off the charts. Here's a quote from Huxley to get us going. "The victory of technology over man," says Huxley, in a forward to one of the later editions of Brave New World, "requires only a highly centralised totalitarian government." Isn't that like what we talk about every week, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? I think it might be. But, he says, there is of course no reason why the new totalitarianism should resemble the old government by firing squads, which is not merely inhumane, it is demonstrably inefficient. And in an age of advanced technology, inefficiency is a sin against the Holy Ghost, or the ghost in the machine. Well, that really means that the belief systems which have been instilled, we have been instilled with belief systems which have nothing to do with reality. And this goes back to what General Petrov says, this guy who was actually allegedly assassinated, but he got it absolutely right when he was talking about this global takeover, which was agreed by all of the corporations in the world with the help of the World Bank, the IMF, to basically take control of all infrastructure that affects all people on the planet. And that is the most dramatic statement that I'd heard in respect of the Agenda 21, Sustainable Development, all this stuff, the urbanization agenda that we're living through, pushing everyone into cities. So it carries on. A really efficient totalitarian state would be the one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. Now, this is something that is brought up with me all the time. People contacting me and they say, "I've listened to your shows and looked into it, and I keep telling people, but they're not interested. It's like they've been programmed and they're not even listening." Well, this is exactly what Huxley was talking about. And I have met some of these sort of people from these aristocratic branches who were involved in the early stages of the planning of all this. And if you listen to one of our shows, which is called Social Engineers Now and Then, and Social Engineers Agents of Control, I think it's called. But if you just look that up on windowsontheworld.net, it goes into this lecture by this guy Richard Day at Mount Sinai in California, I think it was. And it was basically relayed by this fella called Lawrence Dunnigan, who was there. And this Richard Day worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as it is now, or Planned Parenthood as it was then. So all of this stuff and this control of population has been planned a long time. And as I said a few weeks ago, he even got things down to the detail of saying that in the future everyone would be running, i.e. jogging, and everybody would be wearing training shoes, which I thought was one of the most giveaway and profound things in the whole statement, because when you get into that kind of detail and they knew that much, well, that's social engineering taken to an exact and finite point where it's absolutely being projected. This isn't just some loose plan. This is the absolute taking care of everything by social engineers. So this is actually what's happening around us. These docile and compliant people have been lured into mental servitude by the unelected media. Another good point there. We have an unelected media. Now, in the last few weeks, Sky News presenter and broadcaster and alleged journalist Kay Burley was awarded the Journalist and Broadcaster of the Year award. Now, that absolutely means we live in a post-truth world, because there's no way that Kay Burley is a journalist. She's a presenter who believes that she can do interviews and be clever, but her idea of being clever is calling people sexist and this kind of nonsense. And when you listen to what comes out of Sky News, you realise that these people are there for a purpose. They're obviously just there as useful idiots. And we've even covered the BBC, the fake reality, the BBC. Look at CNN. I mean, CNN is the epitome of it all. And that's absolutely coming from a place of the state. And we're going to be talking about that as well, how the intelligence services fit into this, because the intelligence services are where all of this stuff is actually coming from. The psychological nudging through the Tavistock Institute into places like Demos, for instance. Demos is this public policy kind of think tank which puts out these papers on all sorts of different things. They talk about terrorism, and we were there a few years ago at Goldsmith College, and they were there, Carl Miller and Jamie Bartlett, who's now the poster boy of Demos. They were talking about the unreality of conspiracy theory. Now, they didn't know anything about the actual facts of the events like 9/11, for instance, but what they were there to do was control the narrative and tell us how we should be discussing these things. And this is very, very typical of social engineers, because what they do is they control the narrative from the offset. So in other words, there's only certain things on the table, and if it's outside that paradigm, then it doesn't actually exist, so it doesn't get mentioned. And you'll find this in the literature from your local council. They'll give you 3 choices or something like that. So would you like to walk, cycle, or would you like to use the bus? Well, I'd like to use my car. Well, we're not talking about cars because they don't exist anymore. That's the kind of mentality that's happening. So the unelected media is the state apparatus tool, and there's no doubt that it has many of the population under its thumb. However, its influence is waning. If you look at, for instance, the BBC, they're struggling now, which is great, and I hope they start to struggle even more, because in the end they're going to have to give up this narrative and maybe go back to actually putting out things that are helpful to the public. I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. In fact, I think in reality, we will see the end of the BBC before that, and I think Orwell got that right. I mean, this is the whole point. Between Orwell and Huxley, we have exactly the paradigm for the new society, and we're going to talk about that as well, and what capitalism is and how capitalism is presented. We did a show about fascism, actually, because there's obviously the extreme far left, which is again coming from the intelligence services through the think tanks, then into the stupid, lame-brained media, that there's this sort of extremist threat of far right along with Islamist extremism. They've lumped it all in together, and now we've got this thing, oh, capitalism's evil. And the new form of technocracy means that they would have to actually get rid of capitalism. Now, we're going to also talk about what capitalism is a bit later in the show, but this is actually what's happening around us all over, and I'm getting more and more, I suppose the word is not, I'm not surprised by it anymore, but what I'm finding is that this is now in its closing stages, this plan, and people don't even know about it yet. So in other words, the frogs have already been boiled. However, what there has to be is an underground kind of insurgence against this, and the bringing back of natural law, which is another thing we talk about. So what we've got at the top, we've got truth, and then we've got the priest class who interface between the lies. The lies are presented through the media and through the technocracy. And there's lie 1 and lie 2. We always have 2 lies, and we are usually fighting one lie against another. So the public are willing to be subverted and used as proxies by the state. And you find this all the time. Most of what people say is not even their own. It's not their own at all. And that's a really interesting thing as well, because that takes us back to psychology. And there's loads and loads of people involved in the subversion of people's minds. And I'm not just talking about advertising here, not just talking about people like Edward G. Bernays and his empowerment of women by getting them to smoke, these kind of things, and the use of advertising. But it's gone to a different level now. And of course, with all this data mapping, there is no data protection. This is another thing that's really interesting. There's no data protection in this country. The Data Protection Act is there to protect corporations against us asking questions. That's all it's there for. And every organisation has gatekeepers. I've come up against this the last couple of years. Everything is absolutely in the hands of useful idiots and gatekeepers. You will never be able to make a complaint and your voice will never be heard. However, we have to go higher and start challenging the people who are publicly liable. Now, we have talked about this a long time, but, and I will say this with some confidence, I've had a lot of success, and just listen to the shows last few weeks, we've actually managed to make a big impact. I mean, we brought down the council website, which was naming and shaming people a couple of weeks ago in Waltham Forest, did that with one phone call. So just think what you can do out there. Just think what two people could do. Absolutely fantastic. You know, you can have fun with this as well, because these local councils, these useful idiots, once you've dealt with a few, they're quite easy to deal with. They react in a very Pavlovian way because they're just trained. I mean, they're not all evil, I'm not saying that, but when people are in these posts, they're trained in a certain way. And whether it's against their better judgment or whether they're going along with it because they believe it is beside the point. They're still enforcing it. So they're basically acting like thought police. And again, we've done loads of stuff on this political correctness, the LBGT agenda. It's all there as distraction and nonsense to stop you thinking about things that are important, the things which actually really do divide and rule, not these stupid, trivial surface issues which the new liberals, the new the last couple of generations are actually programmed into. Now, the thing that's most striking is that propaganda is simple and repetitive. There's nothing clever about it. That is the main point that I find all the time, is that when I look at the history of this and look at what these organisations are, in private companies as well, are involved in this to a great extent. We're going to get onto that. Well, they're not doing anything complicated, and psychological operations is used as a means of controlling public thought and narrative all the time. And again, it takes us back to, it all comes out of intelligence services, places like MI5. MI5 is basically just a think tank for the BBC. I mean, they just put out these narratives. They get some officer on there talking about the threat of this, the far right, or this, or whatever it is this week, and they spout these things, and of course then the public believe it. Then it's all in the papers and it's all over Sky News, and Kay Burley gets to be presenter and useful journalist of the year because she repeats it all, and so do the BBC. I'm not just picking on her, but the fact that she won this award, I just can't believe it, because there are really investigative journalists out there, and I can't quite understand why the word journalist is used. Well, I can, obviously, because it's the Empire, Murdoch, etc., and the whole, well, the technocracy. Let's call it the technocracy, yeah. So it's aimed at shutting down debate on anything important and concentrating on these trivial issues which are there merely for distraction. We've done many shows on social engineering. It all started years ago. These subversion tactics are used in Soviet Russia. They were used, and that's been really put out by us, because I think that that's an important thing, where people like General Petrov and of course Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet defector, look at his stuff. I mean, it is absolutely a blueprint for how the media works in this country, the unelected media. So this updated version merely has a technocratic face, and it's presented as progress and regeneration and of course gentrification. All these are just words for a power base takeover. Now, I've just picked this up. I've got some interesting items to start with. Facebook has asked several major US hospitals to share anonymised data about their patients, such as illnesses and prescription info. Now, all of this stuff is available to corporations because it's all sold off. It's all sold off through drug companies. We're talking about a massive operation here. And of course, we have a privatised NHS in this country. We've talked about that. It's been privatised. The public don't quite know yet, but the infrastructure's all been privatised. But this was for a proposed research project. Facebook was intending to match it with the user data it had collected and help the hospitals figure out which patients might need special care or treatment. That's good of them, isn't it? The proposal, it says here, never went past the planning phases, as it's put on pause after the Cambridge Analytica data leak scandal. Oh yeah, right, okay. So they're using that as a cover story, in my opinion. It raised concerns over how Facebook and others collected and used detailed information about Facebook users. Well, didn't Zuckerberg say this years ago? I mean, he told people, and when you sign up to Facebook, it tells you that they're going to share all your information. It's not yours once you give it to them. This is the point. There's no intellectual copyright on Facebook. You can't call anything your own after you put it on there. It's theirs. It's not yours. You're merely using it. They've claimed authorship of all your photographs, all your opinions, and everything you say. I mean, I've stopped using it to a great extent, but I still see people basically in their echo chambers, which was a paper, ironically, that came out of Demos, saying that people were in their own echo chambers. Well, there's no bigger echo chamber than the mainstream media, but they failed to mention that. However, they did say that the work on this Facebook sharing of data with hospitals has not progressed past the planning phase, and we have not received, shared, or analysed anyone's data. Yeah, right, a Facebook spokesman told CNBC. But as recently as last month, the company was talking to several health organisations, including Stanford Medical School and American College of Cardiology, about signing the data sharing agreement. While the data share would obscure personally identifiable information such as a patient's name, Facebook proposed using a common computer science technique called hashing to match individuals who existed in both sets. Well, basically, this is just like how you get adverts popping up when you've ordered something from Amazon. It's all the same sort of thing, and this stuff's well advanced, and of course they've got the facial recognition software in there as well. Facebook says the data would have been used only for research conducted by the medical community. Oh, it's a community now, isn't it? So Big Pharma is now a community. Of course it is. Now, I love this word community, because what it is, it's people who have identity groups. They call themselves a community. But they're not the community, they're actually just a group within what is broadly called a community. So basically, what this idea of this new community is just people with special interests who call themselves a community within a larger structure. It's absolutely comical. The project could have raised new concerns about the massive amount of data Facebook collects about its users and how this data can be used in ways users never expected. Really. So that's quite an interesting one. It said Facebook said on Wednesday that as many as 87 million people's data might have been shared in this way. Well, in legal terms, might means must. It means it has. It's like when the police say anything you say may be used in evidence against you. No, what they're saying is everything you say must be used against you. The company has recently announced new privacy policies. Oh yeah, and controls meant to restrict the type of data it collects and shares. Now that data can be used. It's a little bit late for that, because as soon as you sign up, they've got everything. You can use it for whatever they want. Now, I had an email today from Alison. She said, "Hey Mark, tomorrow, I'm going to the police to report Hounslow Council for posting fraudulent and unlawful signs all over town. They have signs everywhere saying, if you drop litter, we will fine you £400. Now, me, you, and anyone who knows the law, knows a court of law can issue a fine. Now, this takes us into what we talked about the other week with NSL, basically the litter and dog poo police being exposed for what they were. Taking pictures of people in public places and then getting the council to post them on their named and shamed Grindbusters website, which, thanks to Windows and the World, has gone. So there you go. So carrying on. The council and even the police have no authority to issue a fine. Well, yes, fines can only issue by courts. But the point is that there is a kind of agreement with things like penalty charges. But again, they are charges and not fines, you see. If there's a £400 penalty charge, that would have been okay. But a fine, you're absolutely right, Alison. Get onto them about that. But also, it's worth looking at their websites to see if they're naming and shaming people yet. And if they are, you can use the letter, the idea of the letter, or I'm sure you'll get your own one going out there, of how to write in to the people who put this up, which is basically the communications department, and record the phone call and maybe send it in, and we can have you interviewing a local idiot at the council. That would be great. Sorry, a useful idiot at the council. Yes, so there you go. They can issue fixed penalty notices, as I've just said, but these are not fines. If the Hounslow Council sign said, if you drop litter, we will issue you with a £400 fixed penalty notice. Yeah, we've just been through. That's great, Alison. She says, give me a shout out for tonight. Say hello to Alison Gulliver. Hello, Alison. Thank you very much for that. And now we go on to where we were talking about a few weeks ago, which is Waltham Forest, and we got their Grindbuster site taken down a couple of weeks ago, as they're posting pictures of people up there, which they shouldn't be. It says, apparently, London Borough of Waltham Forest has put itself forward for yet another unmerited award. This is the Streets for All people in Waltham Forest, and they actually go to these meetings and they organised a hustings with all these different people and basically let the lobbyists have their say. And of course all the people who were pro the open concentration camp known as Mini Holland were there shouting what a great idea it was in their cycle helmets, presumably, and people who actually had to take their kids to school were saying no, it's not a good idea. So we are getting the predicted basically product of the psychological nudging here, which is people fighting each other. It says this time it's an award from the Institution of Civil Engineers. How anyone can think taking space from pedestrians and taking away bus lanes, closing off essential transport routes, etc., can qualify anyone for an award, we fail to comprehend. So if you don't think they deserve one, do vote for one of the other projects and spread the word widely. So yeah, they put themselves up for, it's the London Civil Engineering Awards. So if you live in Waltham Forest, go to the London Civil Engineering Awards People's Choice voting form. The People's Choice voting form. Oh, I love that, the People's Choice. We get a choice. Yes. What do we want? More cycling. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? High density housing. When do we want it? Now. Whose sweets? Our sweets. Yes. It's all that all over again. Now I found this from the, this is going to tie into what we're going to talk about. It's all interlinked, this stuff, folks. From the 2016 Independent. More than 500,000 public sector workers put through prevent counter-terror training in bid to spot extremists. Now, the prevent strategy came out of a thing called Contest from years ago, and I think you may recall that we've talked about it, and anyone who follows David Icke will know that his talk was recently shut down. I think it was in Leicester or Coventry or somewhere. And it was the local police who had deemed him to be a threat, an extremist threat. And when he went into the police station, they couldn't actually tell him what their intelligence was. I love this word intelligence because put British intelligence together and you get the security services and the people who work for them. But the two words shouldn't really go together, in my opinion, anymore. I mean, there was a time when this stuff worked at the turn of the century. And people can say, well, it's still working, but once you know how it works, it's a busted flush, really. It doesn't really work anymore. But it says here, yeah. It was training courses. Now, this was this prevent strategy. So get that again, yeah? This was 500,000, 500,000 public sector workers were put through the prevent counter-terror training in a bid to spot extremism. And so it says even nurses, teachers, childminders and other frontline public sector workers have been put through a mass counter-terrorism training program to help them spot and report potential extremists in their workplace. Now, talk about getting the public to police themselves and each other. The Home Office has confirmed that of the it's 550,000 here, now trained in the controversial prevent strategy, at least 150,000 people are public-facing NHS staff, such as doctors and nurses. They have all completed various online or classroom exercises to comply with a statutory, you see. This is what's interesting about it. When I read that word, that it was a requirement by local councils to spot people vulnerable to I love the word vulnerable. Because you've got to be vulnerable, you see, to be an extremist, haven't you? I mean, vulnerable extremism. Talk about the doublespeak world of 1984, the vulnerable world of extremism. Prevent duty that was forced on a wide range of public authorities by Theresa May as Home Secretary last year. Of course, she's now people say she's the Prime Minister, but I don't really know what that means. I think she'd be okay at a women's institute selling jam or something like that. She'd probably be quite bossy and she'd rise up through the ranks quite quickly, but certainly not in the position that she's in, and that's been very much exposed. I love the way these very powerful and forthright politicians suddenly become unmasked very, very quickly. And this ludicrous photographs of these Tory MPs with their legs apart. It started with Cameron, and now they've got photographs of them all with their legs about 3 feet apart, and it's meant to be. There's some PR agency going, it's a combative pose. You know, it shows power. It shows you're anchored to the ground. No, it doesn't. It looks as though you've actually soiled yourself, and this is the problem that these people have now got. Is they've been made to look like the useful idiots they are, and we know that they're just puppets. So it says anyway, this prevent thing, right? It says aimed mainly at tackling Islamist extremists and of course far-right white supremacists, which I don't think there are any of those really. Well, not many left. We can talk about this alt-right, which is all basically run by Friends of Israel. I can say that with some confidence because I have actually researched it, and you don't have to do much research to find out where it's all coming from. And if you look at Breitbart and what they were saying about Ursula Haverback the other week, this lady who debated on the Holocaust issue, and she's been threatened and put in prison, and they're saying she's on the run. I think she's 97 or 87, I think. It's absolutely pathetic, but anyway, different issue. Back to this. It says it's one of the biggest counter-terror awareness programmes ever undertaken by the UK government. It says some in the Muslim community and beyond feel Prevent is divisive. Well, of course it's divisive. That's the whole point. It creates a climate of suspicion. That's the whole point. And is an attempt to create a huge network of spies, which it's successfully done. 550,000 spies there, including people who work in nurseries. So you're gonna get these childminders, and they're all going to turn up, and they're going to be interviewing the kids about being vulnerable to extremism. The training courses themselves, particularly those online, are also being criticised as inadequate, and an exercise in box ticking that is not being taken seriously enough by attendees. Under the Prevent strand of the government's counter-terror strategy, contest extremism is defined as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. Now, what is that? What does that mean anymore? Well, fundamental British values would have thought of men actually standing up for your country, if there was one, which there isn't, and basically having a bit of pride in the place. And that doesn't mean working for the council, tidying up, doing their job as part of the voluntary sector of slavery. It means something else. It means actually thinking for yourself and thinking about what sort of government we have. Because we have these people there who are in this very old building called the Parliament, and there's this belief by a lot of people in the country that these people are actually running things. Well, no, I'm afraid they're not, as we know, most of us who listen to this show, however. But he says, vocal active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. Anyone who calls for the death of members of our armed forces is also an extremist according to the policy. Yeah, well, I suppose you could say that, but I mean, we're getting into the area here, again, of the intelligence services, because the intelligence services are manufacturing a lot of this so-called extremism, and then we've got 550,000 useful idiots out there looking for it. The Prevent duty requires a large range of public sector workers to be trained, and also include college lecturers, youth and social workers, probation officers and childcare providers. Unbelievable. But many Prevent trainees have simply clicked through online tutorials recommended by a Home Office catalogue. Very interesting point this, because this is where it all falls down. The bureaucracy can only be as good as the people who are in charge of it, and look who's in charge of it. I mean, we've got a ruthless bureaucratic governance, but it's the people who actually bring it in. Again, we've dealt with them, and the public can deal with them, but these huge bureaucracies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and soon I think everybody will be working in the public sector, because self-employment is being absolutely destroyed, and that's a fact. But but it says here about they take up about an hour to complete these courses, and one provider charges up to £30 a head for a module that uses a snakes and ladders game to teach people about paths to radicalisation. It's just incredible stuff. Now, this is interesting. We're going to get into the Centre for Applied Intelligence. Have you heard of it? It sounds very 1984, doesn't it? It does sound a bit like the Department of Propaganda. The Centre for Applied Intelligence is a new think tank dedicated to the science of behaviour change, and it launches today. This was in 2015. The Centre for Applied Intelligence is a cross-discipline think tank. Oh, we've got so many of these think tanks, haven't we? But I think we're going to have the non-think tanks. These are the ones that are going to be really important. Don't think tanks. Because really the people in them are not capable of thought. They're capable of repeating and propaganda, but they're certainly not capable of thought, because if they were capable of thought, they wouldn't be working for these propaganda institutions. They just wouldn't be. Anyone who can do any form of critical thinking would never work for a think tank. So, think tank, it will harness the power of words and speech. Get this, harness the power of words and speech, conducting primary research in all areas of verbal messaging. Basically mind control, okay? So that's the Centre for Applied Intelligence, Centre for Applied Intelligence. It launches at a crucial time when academic research into the psychology of behaviour and persuasion has mushroomed. But there are only a handful of teams distilling and transmitting that new research for the audience who need it. Research needs to have impact, and the Centre for Applied Intelligence will deliver that. I'm sure it will. I think of Demos and all of the think tanks under the intelligence services, and Demos, of course, is linked in with MI5 and the Tavistock Institute. We've done stuff on the Tavistock Institute. Of course, the Tavistock Institute was basically there to propagandise the British people against the Germans for the First and Second World War, and the Tavistock Institute is housed in the same building as the Economic and Social Research Council and the British Psychological Association, who are always putting out these papers on psychological manipulation. We covered this. Could psychology hold the key to going beyond the post-truth world? Well, no, it couldn't, because psychology is the post-truth world. There is no truth in psychology whatsoever. Now, applied psychology can be quite interesting, but I'm talking about the generalization that's used within the whole term psychology. There are people who did some very interesting work in it. I'm not talking about them. But I'm talking about the psychological nudging, basically the intelligence services and the programming and all of the steering that's going on. So yeah, in addition to primary research, the Centre for Applied Intelligence promotes and facilitates, we've got all these facilitators everywhere, facilitates the work of other professionals and academics in this field. Well, this is what universities are for, and of course universities are the hotbeds of radicalisation. They're the hotbeds of radicalisation into the new communitarian, communist, whatever you want to call it, agenda, the extreme far left, and the rejection of what they think is capitalism, which we're going to get onto in a bit actually, because we covered fascism and what that really was, and it's and the definition that's used by these useful idiots like Antifa is nothing like what it's actually meant to be about. It's about the state taking control, but the state actually upholding values. What we have is the state destroying values. That's the big difference of the new form of global control. It says ultimately its work will better define the systems and processes inherent within truly effective communication. It will organise regular events. They do, you see. And of course, there's people attending these things all the time. They'll publish papers by its staff and by external experts. Oh, I love this, experts. There's so many experts about, aren't there? When we get experts on the news, that's great when we get the experts, especially the intelligence experts. They're my favourites, you know, because they always tell us what the new perceived threat is. And of course, we talked about the recruiting of people into the intelligence services, basically, and civilians into the 7-7 Brigade, which is a psychological operation against the public, a war of words on Facebook and Twitter announced in 2015. And we do have General Ord Wingate, and he's got something to share with us because he's particularly displeased this week as two of his old RAF mates have been brought in to sit at desks trolling the public. So over to you.
Jumbo and Bodger, Facebook trolling in Berkshire? What a waste of human resources!
Well, I couldn't really agree more, because it is a waste of human resources, and this is the whole point of it. That is any of this effective? Well, what it's doing is just creating big bureaucracy, and that's what's needed. So yeah, it says the Centre for Applied Intelligence's first priority is the development and refinement of models of behaviour change, a programme titled Rapid Audience Insight Diagnostics, RAID, RAID, All this stuff, even if it's benign, they make it sound sinister. They explained, the head of programs, Tom Welsh, explained, we need to reach those who need to know. As we've said in the past, everything is on a need to know basis. There is nothing put in front of the public that they need to know. Everything is on a need-to-know basis. So in other words, you have to find this stuff out for yourself, and none of it's actually hidden. All our output will be tailored for busy practitioners and decision makers. This is another one we hear all the time, isn't it? Decision makers. Basically, numbskull corporates and people like that. I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush here, but when they say decision makers, we're not really talking about people who make decisions, are we? Wait a minute. Oh, we've got General Ordgate on again. He's going to tell us about some decision makers and the latest psyops. Go ahead.
Good morning, 7th Brigade. Threat level is raised to bikini black, and reptilian craft have been spotted on the dark side of the moon.
Oh, right, thanks for that. I thought it was flat Earth this week, because I thought it was the flat Earth that we were going to be discussing in the media, because that was the big thing coming out of the intelligence services a while ago. The use of that, I suppose you think 9/11's an inside job. I suppose you think there's a world conspiracy. I suppose you think the world is flat, that sort of thing. Flat earthers, please don't start tapping into the chat box because we're not going into that debate this week. It was just basically how it's being used. So it says we need to reach those who need to know. All our output will be tailored for busy practitioners. We want to discover interesting things, but we want even more to show how it would be useful to you. Well, who's you? Well, the decision makers. This is an interesting one. So the research partner to the Centre for Applied Intelligence, and this is how I actually found the Centre for Applied Intelligence. It all works when you look at one thing, everything links up with this stuff, as it does with, I suppose, with everything else. But there's an organisation called Verbalisation Limited, which is run by an ex-army guy called Sven Hughes, and he's the founder of the Centre for Applied Intelligence and Verbalisation Limited. He said, now this is an ex-soldier who's basically he's contributing to major corporations, actually. We'll get onto that in a minute. It says, too much communication is founded on guesses and assumptions. We know there is a better way. The Centre's research will understand the stickiness of content, quantify relevance and resonance, and ultimately show us how to calibrate compelling conversation. That is enormously valuable for verbalization and for the industry as a whole. The Centre for Applied Intelligence's experts, all experts here, are available for comment on stories with a behaviour change or a messaging aspect. The Centre for Applied Intelligence welcomes submitted articles, new conversation and input from those working on parallel tracks. And this is tying in to a video that was done for Quilliam, which is this other think tank organisation which is about stopping radical extremism. And the video is called Not Another Brother. And it's about the radicalisation of young Muslims who would then go over to Syria. And it's the most cornball thing ever. I'm sorry, Sven, but it's absolutely the product of people within the intelligence services. And I don't mean that in a detrimental way. I've got nothing against people in the intelligence services at all. They're generally there for the welfare and well-being of the public. But this is another one. The Neuro Marketing Science and Business Association, here we go, is the global trade association for everybody with a professional interest in the field of neuromarketing. And their catchphrase is, not all decisions are rational. It says, at MindLab, we are passionate about uncovering the real drivers of consumer behaviour because we don't just ask people what they think, we found out how they feel. mindlab.co.uk. Again, our online neuromarketing consumer research tools are founded on System 1 implicit testing. They allow us to quantitatively test anyone, anywhere. We uncover behavioural and subconscious consumer insight that transforms the effectiveness of your marketing communication. It's not about where this starts, everybody, but where it stops. Because this is the entry point, and it's going into the Internet of Things, and it's going into the data sharing, it's going into mind mapping, it's going into the whole thing. And this is another association that's been set up. It was established in 2012. Now, this is Mr. Hughes said the Army reservist was using psychological warfare. This is the headline: the Army Reservist using psychological warfare to rethink marketing. Dissuading young Muslims from joining IS is just one campaign of the ex-soldiers consultancy Verbalization. It's ultra discreet and does not boast about its clients, but he will say, possibly because of my media hat, this is someone from the Evening Standard, which is not even a newspaper, that recent clients include the Financial Times and Dow Jones. Verbalization thinking lay behind the Quilliam Foundation's short film Not Another Brother, aimed by the counter-extremism think tank at persuading young Muslims not to join IS. Now, this is really interesting because this is where it all ties in. So basically it's people in ex-military intelligence who are working with what you could call the bigger picture of public relations. That's all it is, because everything is public relations now. And there's a great book that came out in the 80s called Toxic Sludge is Good For You, how news became public relations and was taken over by PR firms. It says, we take a great deal of time decoding the target audience. It's all military. We decode the target audience, then we pattern match that psychology. I think that should be Mr. Wingate saying that, actually. We take a great deal of time decoding the target audience, then we pattern match that psychology. It's more effective, deeper listening followed by communications to achieve measurable behaviour change. He has a tendency to use a cocktail of management and military speak and acronyms. Oh, a bit like our cartoon character from early on then. I'd like to interview Sven, actually. I think it'd be fun just to see where he's coming from, because I did meet somebody who was responsible for the People's Assembly, basically controlling the People's Assembly many years ago. He tried to get us involved in something which we didn't really want to do, which was cover some event on in London, and I knew it was basically a thing. It was like marching against corruption. You know, how vague can you get? And the chap was basically doing his Alex Jones bit and organising people with a megaphone, and he's been spotted in several places. He's interesting chap, and he's very good at his job, and basically he's safeguarding the public. But the thing is that we have to make this delineation here. I mean, there's nothing wrong with what these people are doing because they're working for the state and they believe in the state. There's nothing wrong with their motivation in that respect. It's just that where it all crosses over into our lives, this is where I draw the line. I don't want to be psychologically nudged. In fact, I think it's pretty impossible for myself to be psychologically nudged after what's happened to me over the past few years. But however, I will say, Mr. Piers Corbyn has arrived at Windows Towers, and we will be broadcasting the second part of the show with Mr. Corbyn. But I've got so much to get through here, I don't know whether I'm actually going to be able to do it. But anyway, we'll just carry on with this. It's telling them where we are going to capture them. This is great. This was great bit. I want to share this one. They've had notable successes. For the FT, the Financial Times, they were hired to push the weekend package. And Sven says, we achieved the largest growth in subscription in its 127-year history. Now, that is pretty impressive. And so this so-called journalist has gone, but isn't PSYOPs a bit sinister? Psychological operations, that is. Apparently not. And so Sven carries on, it's where the bombing stops. A way of achieving desired aims without having to resort to bloodshed. So that's what psychological operations are all about. They're making you drop the gun before you fire it, basically, out of fear. It says, telling them we were going to capture them rather than kill them was a much more effective way of getting them to put down their weapons and walk off the battlefield. Of course it would be, when you looked at what happened during the last Iraq war, with the terrible things that were done to prisoners, being electrocuted and all sorts of obscene things done to them by these soldiers who are crazed out of their heads, apparently, on drugs and all the rest of it. And that was the tip of the iceberg. That's what we saw. Now, I'm not suggesting that all the military involved in that kind of thing, but the battlefield and the tendency and the training does steer people in that direction. And as we all know, it's all about steering. It's all about mind control. And this goes into even the lower level of it, like the Saul-Alinsky rules for radicals. This is what this intelligence guy is using. It's the same thing. In other words, the threat of something is much more important than the actual thing itself. So the fear that can be put out is much more effective. Fear is a great psychological tool. It's the most important psychological tool going. So this is quite interesting as well. We've got this investigative journalist, he calls himself. Nafiz Ahmed, and I was looking at his website, and it's called Insurgents. Again, this is all about military. It's all military terms they're using. I mean, it's such a giveaway. He calls himself a recovering academic, tracking the crisis of civilization. Oh, you can give him some money on Patreon as well. But he writes for the Quilliam Foundation, and this is published by Insurge Intelligence. I mean, this is meant to be investigative journalism. Insurge Intelligence. It's a crowd-funded investigative journalism project, and the Quilliam Foundation's at the centre of it, a counter-extremism think tank in London that has influenced British government national security strategies and has received over $1 million in funding. Apparently its funding is drying up a bit now. It's from an American conservative philanthropic organisation with close ties to the Tea Party. Oh, and extreme right-wing Christian networks. Well, that's a load of rubbish, really, because most of these extreme Christian networks are actually being persuaded the other way. In other words, for the propagation of the power of that third party, the third party who won the Eurovision Song Contest, who we don't need to name. The funding comes in the form of a grant from the John Templeton Foundation, $1 million, covering the period of September 2014 to 2017. Just think what Windows on the World could do with $1 million. We won't be bought out either. Oh, maybe that's why we're not getting it. One of the project leaders for the grant is Gaffer Hussain, a former managing director of Quilliam. He's no longer formally employed by Quilliam, but today manages the government preventing violent extremism. So that's the beginning of the show. He's now in charge of Prevent in the London borough of Newham. So, yeah, it's this article called on this site called "Only Collective Intelligence Can Help Us Stave Off an Uninhabitable Planet. Humanity Needs New Tools to Overcome the Global Crisis of Collective Insanity." So this guy, I'm going to call him a useful idiot, he's going into exactly the climate action plan, global governance, basically saying that the way we conquer and, well, divide and conquer ourselves is to give up all of our power, all of our individuality, and face the crisis. There has to be a crisis, because after crisis we get normalization. So we get destabilization, then we get demoralization, which has already happened, and then we get the crisis, and then we get the normalization. That's the old Soviet model that's been brought up to date by the global governance. So the world faces an unprecedented convergence of crises. The ecological crisis, which points to a near uninhabitable planet by the end of the century, if business as usual continues, is perhaps its most apocalyptic dimension. There has to be an apocalypse, you see. You can't have a resolution without an apocalypse. There has to be one. And the only apocalypse that I think we could possibly face is a comet hitting the planet, because there is great evidence to suggest this has happened about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And there is no evidence to state that it's not going to happen again. In fact, it's been the norm throughout history. And this term catastrophobia came from there. So, in a way, these people are all playing into this inbuilt psychological fear that we've all got of an end of the world. Well, this is the point. We've been genetically engineered to only last a certain amount of time. But there's a bigger plan going on here. And I hope that people are getting it. It carries on. But the ecological crisis is intimately bound up with the business as usual political, economic and cultural structures of industrial civilization as we know it. Excuse me. I reported on an analysis, he says, by British investment firm Schroders, which concluded that at our current rate of burning fossil fuels, no such thing as fossil fuels, you can look that up, global average temperature would rise by as much as 7.8 degrees centigrade by 2100. Now, there's no evidence for any of this, and so this guy, Nafiz Ahmed, he's just a useful change agent. The catastrophic collapse of GDP at this point by more than 50% would be the least of our problems. Well, who says that's going to happen? As I say, we're much more likely to get hit by a comet. Also unleashed would be uncontrollable amplifying feedback processes that would lead to loss of most of the world's coral reefs. Now, that's actually not true. Listen to people like Niels Axel Morner, world's leading expert on sea levels, and I've met him several times. We've done several shows with him. We actually showed that all this coastal depopulation thing which is going on is nonsense. It's to control coastal areas, get people living in cities. The sea levels aren't going to rise that much. It's absolutely ridiculous. So these people who are getting this money, million dollars, to promote, guess what? The global agenda. Oh, I wonder how that works, as if we didn't know. And Mr. Corbyn's arrived, and we'll be getting into the picture of the global governance and the global climate in part 2 of the show. But this is the intelligence services, of which is definitely a part of another one. Is there anyone who's getting promoted here who's not part of the intelligence services? I don't think so. And he carries on. We don't act as a single species. We don't act as a collective. We don't identify as a whole. What's that? One world government. No individuality. No personality. Brave new world. That's what he's advocating. We operate as completely dissociated entities. Individuals, families, communities, towns, cities. Well, they're not completely dislocated entities. Tribes, nations and continents. So his idea of global governance is having one governing body running everything. That's actually what he's saying. The issue is intelligence, communication and adaptation. You said it, intelligence, yeah, military intelligence. Human beings are complex adaptive systems. What on earth is he going on about? The biological systems of which we are constituted evolved through genetic adaptations, but not in the way he's talking about. We've definitely been genetically modified, but he's a Darwinian by the sound of it, and we have been into that in previous shows. This is a huge part of it. Social Darwinism is a huge part of making this thing work. In other words, we've got social Darwinism, we've got people competing all the time. No, they're programmed to compete, and then they're going to be programmed not to compete. They're going to be programmed just to be docile. So it's dead simple. Dead simple. For evolution to be successfully carried on, adaptation has to be collective. Yes, the new world global governance. As the human species scales the most perilous self-made global crisis it has ever experienced, we are called to evolve beyond the old paradigm, the business-as-usual forms of structure and behaviour across politics, culture, economics and ideology that have brought us this far, but now threaten to destroy us by our own hands. Oh, this guy is an absolute plank. Then he has an article about how the CIA made Google. So basically that's how the intelligence services work. And that's how psychological operations work, whether he knows it or not. You give people 70% of what they want to hear. Everybody knows that Google is an intelligence organisation. Of course it is. It's absolutely plainly obvious. An idiot can tell that. It works as an intelligence services operation. So he posts all this, and then he talks about the post-carbon economy. And this is the funny thing to round off this part of the show. Tommy Robinson had a link with the Quilliam Foundation, which raised questions. The counter-extremism think tank's decision to ally itself with the former EDL leader is viewed by many as a high-stakes gamble. For a few briefly awkward seconds, last Tuesday, this was a couple of years ago, the press conference to mark Tommy Robinson's exit from the EDL eventually was delayed as his newfound Muslim allies in a counter-extremism think tank struggled to open the door to the room of waiting television cameras and journalists. Well, in an uncharacteristic glitch for Majid Nawaz, co-founder of Quilliam Foundation, and a man frequently described as smooth and slick. Well, he's like an oil slick by those who have followed his public profile over the years since his transition from teenage gang member through to jailed Islamist extremist and most recently would-be Liberal Democrat MP and now useful idiot. However, senior figures working in the growing field of the study of counter-extremism and the rehabilitation of former extremists have been viewing its link-up with Robinson as a high-stakes gamble. Now, Robinson is not an extremist. Unfortunately, our Tommy is under the thumb of Israel and its lobbyists, the same as all of the alt-right people, including Katie Hopkins and the rest of them. There's a few on YouTube, I won't bother naming them, but they're all singing from the same hymn sheet. And just look at what our dear Katie promotes all the time with her t-shirt. That's the end of part 1, and we're going to have a short break now. And to take us through the break, let's have Entrée Danse by Anne Piguel. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net. Welcome back to Windows on the World. That was Anne Piguel and Entree La Danse. And we've now got Piers Corbyn in the building. I think he's having his cup of tea because Piers likes to have a cup of tea. And it prepares him for talking about the climate. And we've got a lot to talk about as far as the climate's concerned tonight. And I'm just trying to scroll down here because I had something very important to talk about to open the second part of the show. And it was to do with Northern Ireland. Several people have contacted me from Northern Ireland, and they're actually very worried about what's going on there. There's this new Northern Ireland communities strategy that's taken over very, very quickly. And it's absolutely astonishing because we've got these people getting in touch with the show, and they're talking about this universal credit and how things are being managed, and it looks as though we are going into this technocracy very quickly. So the Northern Ireland communities, which is this local government, I'm just trying to find it actually because I had so much to get through. It's the Department for Communities in Northern Ireland. And it says the policy framework sets out the department's policy objectives for urban regeneration and community development in Northern Ireland for at least the next decade. It provides a clear strategic direction and will inform its partners in central and local government and in the voluntary and community sector. The Urban Regeneration and Community Development Policy Framework gives an overarching structure to the department's urban regeneration and community development activity. We need this policy framework to make sure that when we take action, we have a good reason to do it and that we can measure our activity and be held accountable for what we do. Oh, yes. Now, this is the big point. This means unaccountable corporate governance. Your local councillors are mere puppets, often benefiting from their involvement with the developers, as we've found out, 100 councillors in London, at least, in the pockets of property developers. These are the people who are meant to be actually representing you in your local community. Oh, that word again, community. Now, what community could we be talking about here? Could we be talking about the I'm all right, Jack, I'm not going to respond to you because I'm going to get a very big bank balance through working with property developers, Claire Cobra and the rest of them. Yeah, she's working for Pinnacle now, another property developer. That's the leader of the Haringey Council. We've got a similar idiot in, useful idiot, I suppose, in Waltham Forest. She's called Claire Coghill. And of course, when I write in with all this stuff about making them accountable and taking down their Grindbusters website and all the rest of it, I never get a response from her because she's far too busy getting in front of the camera and telling people how great she is and what she's doing for them, the same as all these useful idiots. Like, MPs now don't do anything. I mean, if you try and get an MP to do something, will they do it for you? If it's trivial and pointless and it's not going to really make any impact, yeah, they'll do it. But if it's going to be anything of importance, they won't do it. So maybe we need some MPs that will do things. That would be good, wouldn't it? It carries on. We must be able to show that when we carry out urban regeneration and community development, there are outcomes that contribute to our key priorities. So their mission statement is together tackling disadvantage, building sustainable communities. So this is the Northern Ireland Agenda 21 plan being rolled out. And people there are getting really concerned about it. I've had several people contact me last week, and a fella called Ed phoned me up today. It was very interesting. Thanks for calling me, Ed, and sharing his experiences. They seem to be, it's ironic that they want to be inclusive, but they seem to be excluding people who might be costing the state a bit of money, people who might be ill, for instance, or disabled. And that is something that people need to get to grips with, because we're talking here about a depopulation program. That's what it was in 1969 when Dr. Richard Day talked about it. He worked for Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood. What's that all about? It was all about controlling and reducing population. I was talking to someone actually earlier this evening, and they're saying, well, there's too many people on the planet. Now, if you talk to anybody, right, they'll say there's too many people on the planet. Well, most of the planet's covered in water, so there's no people there. Also, you could have, it's Waterworld, wasn't it? Remember that film when everyone lived on the sea? But there's actually not an overpopulation problem. What they're doing is they're creating an overpopulation problem by pushing everyone into cities. And that's the whole point of Agenda 21. So they talk about population control, well, and fairness for all and inclusive communities. But what they're doing is they're pushing everyone into cities, so the cities are going to be absolutely jam-packed with people, and they're all going to be working for nothing. That's a big part of it. The voluntary sector. That's a big part of what these people talk about as well. But basically, it's basic psychological subversion, like we said in the first part of the show, nudging. It will be making all decisions on behalf of a remote and unaccountable corporate infrastructure, which is labelled community, using the UN Global Action Plan to build a control grid of everything, and nobody will be left behind. Nobody will be left behind. They keep telling us no one's going to be left behind. In other words, you haven't got a choice. But helping people change their lives for the better, meaning complete control at local level enforced with no accountable person available to be made liable for anything. Now, this is important only because of the major changes in the global economy, but also the reform of local government in 2016, when councils, it says, were given a greater role in regeneration and community development. Now, isn't that interesting that actually coincides with this very same thing being announced at the Habitat Conference? And if the Habitat Conference is going every couple of years, and everything that's happening in your local area, indeed Northern Ireland, is coming out of these Habitat Conferences, which are a UN Global Action Plan. So the voluntary sector, let's talk about the voluntary sector, because they do. It means poverty for all and no development or support for anything truly local or original. That means all small businesses getting taxed out of existence, being pushed out in favour of the corporates coming in. And you'll see that happening everywhere. Look at your local town. Who's coming in? Is it new businesses? No. It's new, big businesses. It says the main points of this framework, this is the Northern Ireland framework, the policy framework contains 4 main policy objectives. Tackling area-based deprivation. Well, that actually means putting a good big front on everything, 40-foot pavements, no jobs for anybody, and poverty for all, fronted by a voluntary sector, getting the public to work for nothing. And this, you can see this all over the place. On Twitter, these councils saying, we had a great day with volunteers clearing up rubbish. Wait a minute, I thought we paid our council tax for you to clear up the rubbish. Oh, no. It's the public that do it now. And the public then they get involved in their community, which is like planting bloody flowers in these big tree planters that they put everywhere to block the roads. Creating huge regions and unaccountable bureaucracies. That's exactly what they're doing. Developing more connected and engaged communities is what they say it is. Putting in change agents, useful idiots to control the narrative, exactly. Using big lottery money for enforcement of police state infrastructure, that's what it's about. Urban regeneration, community development, policy framework topics, that's what we've been talking about. This is from their website. A series of documents were prepared which provide an evidence base for the development of urban regeneration and community development policy in Northern Ireland. The regional policy context, comparative policy analysis and literature review documents are all available if you would like copies. So basically, I tried to click on that link. You can't get them. You have to email them. So they send them to you. So they know who they've been sent to. So they know all the people who are interested. And those people, I mean, could they possibly become the future leaders? Could they possibly be the people who are going to be mentored if they say the right things? It might be worth getting a few of us out there to say the right things and get mentored and see what happens. I haven't got the patience for it myself because I've read the documents. Consultation. Oh, wait a minute. Consultation. I don't remember anybody being consulted in the regeneration plans. The proposals for an URCD policy framework were issued for public consultation. The exercise lasted 16 weeks, but nobody seems to know about it. It was carried out from 5th of July 2012. I wonder if anybody knows about that in Northern Ireland. If you'd like a copy of the consultation responses, email us again. You can to provide access to decent, affordable, sustainable homes and housing support services. Yep. Now, what it says here is to meet the needs of the most vulnerable by tackling disadvantage through a transformed social welfare system, the provision of focused support to the most disadvantaged area and encouraging social responsibility. It means we're reducing the payments to disabled people and using strict corporate governance to bring poverty for all and an overt control at local level. That's actually what it means. To bring divided communities together. Oh, it's a bit like Nafeez Ahmed and the Prevent strategy. We've got to bring everyone together by creating urban centres which are sustainable, welcoming and accessible to live, work and relax in peace. Well, they are if you don't drive, and they are if you like 40-foot pavements and tree planters in the road. Monoculture and corporate infrastructure, same as the global model. No cars, people trapped in surveilled and monitored areas. This is the brave new world we talked about earlier on, run by bureaucrats. There will be no divided communities because there will be no communities, but everything's referred to as a community. But under Agenda 21, anything can be a community. A group of stones is a community. So basically, the word community has to be examined here as to what it actually refers to. All historical cultural references will be erased by coffee shops, chain stores and 40-foot pavements with mini apartments of very high density. The open concentration camp is here, folks. That was my little coda there, which I wrote as a note. And Piers Corbyn has joined us. I just want to see if Piers can be picked up by this microphone. Hello, Piers. Can you...
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Can people over there hear me?
I think they can. I think they can hear you. Let me just check. I'll check on the headphones. Piers?
Yep.
Okay, we can hear you. We can indeed hear you. So I'll bring the microphone over to you because we're doing this in Windows Towers at the moment, and we are at a secret location in North London. I wouldn't possibly give you the postcode, even though Google knows where we are. But Piers, welcome. I've been discussing this new framework that's been put into place in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Communities Framework, and it's quite sinister because there's been several people who've contacted me and they're saying they're trying to get the word out to people in Northern Ireland because obviously Northern Ireland, small area, easy to control, and it's a crown territory under the UN, of course, and it's going to be part of the global governance. So, have you heard about this?
Well, not until you told me, but I think the interesting thing is that it's an extension of all the things which are being done in the name of regeneration or community involvement or whatever phrase they use, which are guided by this Agenda 21 and Agenda 30, which is the UN, etc. Program. And it's curious, when people like yourself or programs like yours start talking about this, then you get accused of being conspiracy theorists. But of course, you see, there's no conspiracy involved here. These by what you say, I mean, the point is there are documents there which point the world to behave like this, and I think that what's happening in Northern Ireland is probably an attempt to extend the rule of this type of government structure or pseudo-government structure.
Well, yeah, because it's a fairly small area in comparison to a lot of areas. So, in other words,
trial.
you can put I think that it's beyond a trial. It's just like the implementation has been very quick to happen. We're seeing it in London. Obviously, London is just a collection of villages, really, traditionally, but it's now being put into one big monoculture. And we talk about this all the time. We talked about the Elephant and Castle regeneration. So the whole of South London will be the same. But you'll have Starbucks and you'll have Costa Coffee. So what more do you want?
Well, indeed. You see, I think another interesting is the language they use, because it really is 1984 doublespeak.
Absolutely.
And although there's variants on this theme, I mean, it's not the case that every developer picks up an Agenda 21 document and follows it. What they have is a culture which is promoted for their interests and to divide and defeat communities. For example, you see, on the Aylesbury estate, where the compulsory purchase order hearing was recently finished, and we're waiting for the report, but the Aylesbury estate in Southwark in South London, the developers put forward the argument, or the council did so on their behalf, that they were there to promote diversity. Now, people on our side from the Aylesbury estate pointed out, well, it already is diverse. You can't. So actually what's happening is that communities are being destroyed in the name of promoting diversity. And to be very specific, people moved out have been extremely angry because they've been lied to, basically. One of the blocks nearby that they were moved to, a new block of lower standard than the existing blocks on the Aylesbury, water leaks. Even though the Aylesbury was meant to have water leaks, this place has got loads more water leaks. And specifically, in terms of the difference between people that own their flats and people who are renting, they have two different entrances, which you could call pour doors, if you like. So
I've heard this before, Piers. This is not a new thing.
No, it's not a new thing.
But
see, people are being moved from the Aylesbury estate, where everybody was together, and you didn't know if someone was an owner, occupier, or a tenant. Whereas they move them onto these other blocks, new blocks, where they have separate entrances for people who pay rent, and the ones who don't pay rent, i.e. own properties, are allowed to use the lift, whereas the other people are not allowed to use it.
Well, this is the new form of feudalism, and basically it's the divide and rule strategy, all under the name of diversity, empowerment, and sustainability.
And it's neither diversity, nor empowerment, nor sustainability. I mean, it's just a complete waste of resources. The whole thing's a waste of resources. The people who moved say they wanted to stay in their existing flats and they didn't need to be changed or modified or knocked down in any way.
This is exactly right, but I mean, when you go back to like the 16th century, there was this group in France called the Cagots, and they had to wear a rabbit's foot round their neck. And if they saw a non-Cago on the street, they had to bow their heads and stop. This is the same sort of thing. It's basically going back to the poor laws and all this sort of thing, because the Cagos had their own
poor doors and poor laws. Okay.
That's right. But the Cagos had their own entrances in France to the churches. They weren't allowed to use the public entrances.
Right.
So there's nothing new about this stuff, but it's
like untouchables under Hinduism.
Absolutely. So really, what we've got is, well, what we've been talking about. We were saying that London is probably in this first phase of complete re-engineering. In other words, you've got these stack and pack flats, which are the first stage. So all of the areas that are going to be deemed as desirable in the future, i.e. the ones near transport infrastructure, are going to be raised to a higher level. And so this first phase, I think, will be knocked down in 5 to 10 years, and then the big money will come in.
Yeah,
that's all they're interested in.
I'm sure of that. That's just the logic of it all. If you look at the stuff on the 25% of the Aylesbury estate which has been knocked down, and there's 75% resisting, and I'm sure we can win in the long run. Some of this, Harvard Gardens, for example, it's about half empty. Some of which is because they can't sell them, others they've been bought and kept empty. And you look at the flats and they are, well, there's nothing special about them in any way. All I can think is, and they've got leaks in as well, they will be knocked down in about 10 years' time, and grander things built for the rich, which is the general thrust of any council estate near a park is going to be taken over under their type of agenda. Obviously, we're resisting this, but you look at where the big conflicts are. They are usually near parks where the developers want to build luxury flats with penthouses overlooking the parks, like the Burgess Park is next to the Aylesbury estate. Brockley Park is next to Cressingham Gardens in Lambeth, and the Alton estate is next to Richmond Park, and that really is the cream of the cream, which the developers, I'm sure, in the long run would love to have.
Yeah, but I'm going to go back now to just to link up what I was talking about earlier on with this thing being implemented in Northern Ireland in 2016, which was just by coincidence, nothing to worry about, the same time as the new urban agenda was unanimously adopted at the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, which was called Habitat 3, serving a new vision for our cities and municipalities for the next 20 years. The UNDP demonstrated its full support to the implementation of the new urban agenda with the official launch of its official sustainable urbanisation strategy. So that's what we're talking about. The sustainable urbanisation strategy is actually what it's called. A year later, the UNDP welcomed its strategic plan 2018 to 2021 with the endorsement of member states providing a strategic guidance to UNDP's policy and programmes for the next 4 years. The new plan sets out the direction for a new UNDP to support countries to end extreme poverty. Well, by ending extreme poverty, what they mean is everyone's going to be poor, so there won't be any poverty.
Mental poverty now, and well, mental breakdowns happen in these new places big time. But an interesting thing about all this is, okay, they have meetings. Now, what is the legal status of this? Because this is unelected people making recommendations or laws which are then gobbled up by governments and councils and then reproduced. But
well, they call them consultations, Piers.
Well, of course, but you see, look, we've just finished some council elections. Now, councillors nowhere in these elections were talking about their input into these programmes. They have no input into these programmes. The councillors get elected and then they're told by officers, oh, that this is the norm, councillor. This is what normally happens. I mean, I remember when I was a councillor having discussions with council officers on various things, and then I was just told, well, Mr. Corbyn, this is how it's done. You know, so if you questioned it, well, you were a problem. And if you asked even where it came from, oh, it came from the United Nations, therefore it must be good. Well, this doesn't follow at all. I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on, many of which are extremely bad. Now, you mentioned earlier about a population problem, like too many people in the world. Now, I think this is not the case.
Well, no, I agree with you. That's what I was saying.
Good,
that's actually my point.
I know you were.
We don't have to agree on everything, but in fact, we should have a bit of conflict here, I think, really. But we can't find any uncommon ground.
You see, currently the sea is farmed in a nomadic manner, i.e., land is farmed in an organised way, as opposed to people being nomads and just picking fruit and so on. Now, the sea could be farmed, you know, and made a lot more efficient in its food production. The sea has got 300 times more living space in it than the land, right? So actually, with developing technology, and I don't mean bad things like GM, I just mean common sense, the world population could be 300 times what it is. I mean, it wouldn't actually be difficult. And if you look on a map, most people live in little blobs or on lines connecting the blobs. I'm not saying that 300 times would be Well, it would be possible, I'm sure. I mean, but the thing is, the idea that we're somehow full up now is completely nonsense.
Well, the idea is that they're making it seem that way because they're pushing everyone into cities.
Yeah.
That's the point. So this idea behind this promotion of the overpopulation is all done by pushing people into cities and making them believe there's too many people. Well, there are too many people where the people are, but where
Well,
the
that's
people
right,
aren't
yeah.
living, there aren't too many people. I mean, you can go out into areas of this country where they're still really rural.
Yeah,
And of course, they want to destroy all that. Rural communities are getting absolutely hammered. They're closing down cash point machines, closing down banks everywhere. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff, and I think most people are starting to see it now. But what I'm going to do, Piers, is go
Yeah.
into the signature solutions.
Okay.
Signature solution 1: keep people out of poverty, which involves a mix of solutions that improve rural and urban livelihoods. Sounds good, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Strengthen gender equality. Oh, here we go. Build social protection and provide basic services. Now that sounds great, but I'm going to decode that as it's using the voluntary sector to hide poverty and unemployment, and it's using regenerate areas by destroying all small enterprise and replace with the new control system. Use distraction issues to divide and rule under the banner of diversity and empowerment, which is what we've been talking about all the way through. That's really what that means. Signature solution 2: strengthen effective, inclusive and accountable governance. Well, you see, the thing is
What
that
do these words mean anyway?
well, they mean that
Accountable? They're not accountable.
well,
That's
as we
completely
say,
opposite.
as the UN say, Piers, even in this document, say no one will be left behind, which means that you've got no choice.
Well, we're all left behind.
Well, you have to come along with us. There's no choice. Do you want to do it the hard way or the easy
I
way?
think George Soros is not going to be left behind.
Soros. Well,
Does he participate
well,
in this? Has he got a little cupboard?
I mean, how much longer is he going to live? You know, this is the point. I mean, is he eternal? Has he got?
Well,
I
he could probably be kept going. I mean, all his body parts could be replaced, I dare say, step by step.
George's life matters. Right. So, signature 2: strengthen effective, inclusive, and accountable governments, included at municipal and sub-national levels. Well, that just means the council taking more control, big local government, no public consultation or involvement. Signature solution 3: enhance national prevention and recovery capacities for resilient societies.
Right. Well,
What's your interpretation
well,
of that?
my idea of a resilient society is community groups where if some agent of the council walks in and offers empowerment, that they should be shown the door by the people. In other
God,
words,
that's so negative, Piers.
you can't. I mean, but they come along offering people empowerment, but it's the opposite. They go into communities in order to disempower them. I mean, they have a systematic way in which they disempower communities on council estates. I've seen it all over. First step is you go in and you find ways of closing down community centres or playgroups or whatever, where the people meet, irrespective of whether or not there's a tenants association.
We've covered this for years,
Yeah, we
Piers.
have. And you know,
Yeah.
then the next thing is they will wheedle out the activists if they can, you know, or offer the more active people housing elsewhere once they've got some sort of agenda for demolition, destruction, or whatever. And you know, so it goes on. They create false issues to argue about, and then come in to solve them. You know, it's usually about traffic or about children who have been deprived of community centres, and then they find there's a problem because they've deprived of community centres, and so on. Anyway, need I say more? But the agendas you talk about are actually a blueprint for the opposite of what they claim to be.
Exactly. It carries on. It will help countries avoid crises and return quickly to stable development after crises occur. We talked about that at the beginning. So you have destabilisation, demoralisation, crisis and normalisation. Those are the 4 stages.
Yeah, but what are these crises? I mean, are they... For example, the north of England is in crisis of people in, 0 hours contracts and no productive industry because it's been closed down in the name of saving the planet. The steel industry has been removed. The coal mines have been closed. It hasn't been the end of coal and the end of steel worldwide. No, instead the steel industry has moved to India, and the coal is instead of British coal, it's very smoky stuff pulled out of the ground in, well, often Poland, for example. There's no reduction in carbon dioxide by relocating industry.
But as the UN say, this is not actually an environmental program. It's just sold as an environmental program.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. But it says so we're talking about creating crises here. This is what we've been going on about all the way through, really, and we talk about this a lot. It's basically the crisis and solution, the solutions offered. So to avoid the crisis, well, we're avoiding a crisis. Where isn't the crisis meant to happen first and then you react to it? I mean, usually crises just occur, don't they? See, in reality, a crisis is something that's not expected, right? You don't expect there to be a crisis, otherwise you would have done something to mitigate it. So what they're actually saying is that, well, we can't have a crisis occurring. So, in other words, it's the precautionary principle, which is a big part of this. The precautionary principle states that you have to do something about it before it's happened. So it's a pre-crime, isn't it? So in other words, we don't want you to get radicalised. Well, I wasn't going to. Yeah, but you could have been. I mean, you've been watching those. You've been watching those videos on YouTube. You could have been radicalised. You see. Right. And what would happen if you'd have done a talk like David Icke, and you've influenced all these people? We've dragged you into the police station today just to talk about this, and we just want to know a bit more about you. I mean, it's quite interesting because I'm dealing with the police at the moment for a friend of mine, and they're sitting on the fence, but in actual fact, they're taking in what I'm saying. But it's kind of that you can see that they're demoralised with their situation that they're in. So, really, it's the demoralisation and the crisis is actually what's happening in the public sector, really. All they're doing is covering it up with huge bureaucracy. So, yes, basically implement control through pre-created problems. The crisis will be stage managed and presented to the public, who will accept the predetermined outcome. That's always what happens. Oh, let's get on to signature solution 5. Okay. Close the clean... You'll like this one. Not a lot. Close the clean energy access gap and enhance energy efficiency, which will also help countries reduce the impacts of air pollution, particularly in urban areas. Now, there you go. That's the agenda of the fossil fuels. The fuels that are made out of fossils.
But it's interesting they don't mention carbon dioxide in that, though, of course, the brainwashing from the BBC is meant to make people think it's about carbon dioxide all the time. Yes, you see, it's all part of, as you say, creating false problems in order to find solutions for them. There's not, what's this, the clean energy gap?
Yep.
Well, I don't know what it means, except they want to try and promote something. I mean, they'll be promoting things like solar power or wind farms.
Yeah, so the energy access gap. So basically, they want to be promoting that.
But you see, it was recently pointed out by Richard Lindzen, for example, a leading meteorologist in the USA, who is very sceptical about so-called global warming. He says that the implementation of these wind farm plans actually, and it has been said before too, but he spelt it out in some detail, these anti-CO2 productions of energy actually end up making more CO2, because if you have a wind farm, then it has to have backup from coal-fired or other power stations for when the wind doesn't blow. So you're going to have a permanent overcapacity, and you're not reducing the amount of CO2 produced because you're using up a hell of a lot of CO2 in order to make these things. And when you start talking about storing energy in terms of batteries, they are such an inefficient process that makes even more CO2. I mean, the fact is that the battery in a typical battery car in its production produces as much CO2 as driving an ordinary car for 8 years. So the whole scheme is completely shot to pieces from day one. I think there's some other bogus crises worth talking about. Obviously, the climate change scare is the biggest of all, and this is used to bind together all other devious ways of controlling people. A sub-part of that is the peak oil crisis. Now, I've been to many conferences where people have talked about energy and oil and so forth, and I've asked about the peak oil crisis, and they just laugh. They say, no, there's no peak oil crisis. There never was, because what the oil companies do is they prospect for oil, and when they can see they've got enough to last a long time, or a certain time, say 5 years, then they stop. They stop prospecting. So, and then after another year, they say, oh, we've only got 4 years left. So then people are told to get scared, and then prices can be forced up and so on. But when they feel like it, they then just do further prospecting and get the oil. So the peak oil crisis always was and is fiction.
Well, artificial scarcity is the key.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, any business has to create some sense of exclusivity or artificial scarcity.
Oh, sure. Diamonds.
Then the public run for it every time and say, I've got to get mine. It's like, look what happened a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when you couldn't get petrol? And within 24 hours, there was people on the streets going, I know where there's some in Edmonton. And it's like, but surely you're not even going to run out tomorrow. No, but I might run out the day after, you know. And this is the thing, it's so easy to control the public because we are very dependent on having access to things whenever we need them. Mm-hmm. So we're not used to actually any forward planning at all, mm-hmm. which is exactly how this stuff works. Because if you can plan forward and think ahead, then you would know what was coming and you could see through these strategies. But because we are just trapped into this kind of everything's fed to us and everything's always there, and if something is in the threat of being taken away, or it's going to impact on our small view of the world, then it's an absolute tragedy, and we're going to empty the shelves of food within 24 hours and not pack. It's so easy to get the public to panic. Mm-hmm. And the people who are controlling it, the military intelligence people, they know that because, as we said at the beginning of the show, they're all involved, or they were involved, the ones we've talked about, in psychological operations. So this is just psychological operation. I mean, you have to have artificial scarcity. I mean, nothing can really work otherwise. You know, if there's abundance for everybody, I love the New Age thing, abundance, you know. Well, it's actually not. It's the opposite. It's artificial scarcity that keeps it all going. Yeah. And it's like Sky News doing this documentary, whatever they're doing. We're linking plastic bottles with climate change. You know, so you get
that is insane. Yeah.
I know, but it's really funny because you've got this like, oh, this whale's eating a load of plastic, you know, and it's like, oh God, they cut this whale open. There's all these plastic bottles inside it, you know. And then, well, what's that got to do with CO2? You know, they've linked the two together.
It's got nothing to do with CO2.
Of course it hasn't.
But of course, the other thing is, if you don't use a plastic bottle from Sainsbury's, that doesn't mean there's not any plastic in the Pacific being eaten by whales, because America and China are busy shoveling that in. And the plastic in London, none of it finds its way to the sea. I mean, it's just a nonsense. It goes into landfill, or most of it is burnt in incinerators and turned into electricity. So there isn't actually a problem created by plastic in London, I would say. And I challenge anyone to give evidence that something produced in London is going to find its way into the ocean and be eaten by fish. Now, it's true people could throw plastic bottles off the bridge in the Thames and so forth, but I have to say I haven't even seen that happen at all. You know, I mean, most people are responsible and put stuff in litter bins, right? I mean, yeah, you know. So, plastic is a useful thing, and of course, these people that go on about plastic actually are using it all the time. They should examine their own clothing for a start. And all this stuff is made out of oil, basically, and they're campaigning against oil, but they're using it all the time. Now, I welcome alternatives of using cotton or whatever fibre you can, but the claims made and the actions taken are really part of social control as opposed to solving any real problem.
It brings us back to the United Nations Development Programme. It says it's further evolving and adapting to become more innovative. I can't see that somehow, can you? I mean, there's nothing
not
innovative
innovation
about,
at all.
No, it's the opposite of innovation. It's repetition, but
Yeah.
it's kind of scientifically designed repetition. And efficient. They want to become more efficient to remain a development partner of choice. To whom, I wonder, big corporations, obviously.
Well, it's all about big corporations making large amounts of money through stupid investment schemes which are made to save the world. I mean, dams around the world, destroying the Amazon basin and so forth, massive wind farms. All of these things involve huge amounts of money, which is the daily bread for biggest Wall Street corporations, and these are the beneficiaries. It's not the people that are beneficiaries.
Absolutely not, and they give the game away with their closing statement here. It says, yes, to remain a development partner of choice and to respond effectively to new and emerging needs in an increasingly urbanised world, and to serve the half of the global population that now resides in urban areas.
Right, okay. Well, one solution would be to stop half the world residing in urban centres.
But that's the whole point of Habitat 3. It's the urbanisation agenda, Piers. Which bit don't you get,
Yeah, I was brought up in the countryside, and it was great, right? I mean, there's an interesting article only a few days ago in the Evening Standard, which is a stunning place to find a useful article. But it describes basically the mental stress which people consciously or unconsciously suffer by living in urban environments 24/7. And it describes the traumas of people who are brought up in the countryside and suddenly find themselves in cities and becoming physically ill because they don't see enough green space and so forth. I mean, having green looking out of the window does calm one, and having more greenness around in cities or around wherever you live makes one more productive in living and working. Obviously, the big corporations find it more efficient to keep people in little boxes, but in the long run this makes mental problems, more physical illnesses related to mental problems and unhappiness, and so forth. So I think we have to have a complete rethink, actually, and we should have politicians ought to be campaigning against these urbanisation schemes altogether. I mean, I've been saying down in South London, as far as I'm concerned, the central London stops at Elephant and Castle, and we do not want any more expansion of the tube service into South London, because it's crystal clear that if you live anywhere down the Old Kent Road, there's a developer near you who wants you to want a tube station, so he can up the land value. So the land values go up, and then you can be socially cleansed. I mean, the urbanisation of London equals social cleansing of the working class in it now, and it would be much better if more people continue to live in the countryside.
Absolutely. I'm just looking at the chat room here because I haven't had a chance to look at it tonight, and saying the volume's a bit low. Well, what I didn't want to do was over-modulate, so I'll turn it up a bit now, and it will be much better next week. This is the first time that we're broadcasting from Windows Towers in a secret location in Camden, North London. And yes, I'm just getting used to this new broadcaster, and it's great. I had a bit of a problem early on with it because I was getting feedback and noise through one of the inputs, so that was why I kept it quite low. And I didn't want to, as I say, over modulate, but Mitherin in the chat saying turn the knob up. I think that's what he means anyway.
Okay.
So I've turned it up a bit. Can I have this is Osteu. Can I have a sustainable, renewable, green global energy research grant, please, Mr. Government? I promise I'll say what you want. Osteu, are you a useful idiot in the making here? I think, well, it would be great to have.
I hope you'll fly aeroplanes all over the world to check it out.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
As they do.
Yes, we've got. Yes, Martin says it's plant food CO2, as any school kid knows.
Absolutely.
Yes, but they don't teach that to children nowadays, Martin. Don't you know this? I mean, we were at school when teachers actually used to teach things, and the urbanisation agenda was in its infancy as we were, you know. So yes, just having a look through here. Martin's been busy in here tonight. Yes. Just take a night flight across the UK and you'll see just how populated it is from the lights. It's frightening. Well, yes, the UK is densely populated. It's overpopulated, really, but there's still loads of space in the country. But they don't want us in the country. They want us out of the country.
Yeah, but look, when you see a light, it doesn't necessarily mean there's people. Look, the motorways now, the M4 is lit most of the way. It doesn't mean there's people along every section of the M4.
That's
now,
right.
Actually, the world population, if it was everyone's given a square yard, will fit on, just area like a couple of times or 3 or 4 times the size of the Isle of Wight. I mean, that is a fact. You can work it out, and we'll check that later if you want. So it's not the case that the world is thronging with people. Of course, people demand all sorts of space and gardens and so forth, but it's compared with the animal world, man is pretty insignificant. You see, termites produce 10 times as much carbon dioxide as mankind, for example. And mankind and all his attributes, all his machines and everything, right? So if CO2 is a problem, the government should be having war on termites, but they don't, right? They're interested in controlling you. We could go into other things about the mass of microbes in the world, or the mass of various things in the sea, which is, living things in the sea, which greatly exceeds the total weight of mankind. So I think we have to look at these things scientifically.
Absolutely. But basically, huge corporations will run everything under the new global governance. Change agents will control the narrative of all public opinion, as we said at the beginning of the show, and on many other shows. So basically, it says, collectively, the effort of the UN system, with the lead of UN Habitat, will weave a powerful and impactful WUF9 conference, empowering the engagement of all relevant urban stakeholders towards achievement of the NUA and Sustainable Development Goals, meaning using developers like Lend-Lease to control all infrastructure of all people under corporate governance.
Yeah.
So why don't the public know about this? Well, let's put it this way. Sky News presenter Kay Burley was named Journalist and Broadcaster of the Year. That's all you need to know.
Yes.
Indeed. So, is there any more news this week, Piers?
Well, I think it's worth reflecting on things going on in the councils after the local elections, because there was a very big swell of opinion all over London, and I think in other cities, against developers. And every meeting I went to in Southwark, the voters were railing against the way the council, the Labour council, is hand in glove with developers. And in the run-up to the election, a number of councillors who hitherto had been just going along with everything stopped the Elephant and Castle regeneration development scheme. What they're going to do after the election, I don't know, but you see, they've sort of nailed themselves to a mast now. And I know in the Labour group there, or other Labour groups, there have been a lot of ructions against the pro-development initiatives of Labour councils. And in Haringey there's been very big changes. The so-called Haringey Development Vehicle, which I would say is the Haringey Social Cleansing Vehicle, has been stopped. I mean, I'm sure there's developers around trying to revive it, but, huge changes have happened in Haringey. And I think people ought to keep a close watch on that and go along to Labour Party meetings or whatever, especially if they're part of the Labour Party. But, I mean, there's various meetings that go on where you can put more and more pressure and demand accountable government, and point out there's no role for developers at all in reality in improving London. By developers, I mean the way the developers we currently see, who are there to build properties to sell off for the highest possible price to money laundering operations. We do need some sort of developers or people paid to build things, but they have to be paid to build council housing, etc., which is not going to be sold on. So we need a different financial model instead of the super profits short-term theft, which Delancey and Lendlease are committed to.
Yes, I'm going to finish off with this is from the NUA unhabitat.org website, which is going to become increasingly important for people to know about, because they're going to find that wherever they're living is going to be looking like this. So get this one. Development must protect the planet and enable all inhabitants, whether living in formal or informal do you know anyone who lives in an informal settlement, Pete? Because I don't.
Yeah. Well, people are sleeping on park benches, but then of course they get moved on, don't they?
Well, yeah, but they've started putting spikes on the park benches now, and they put handrails in the middle so you can't lie on them.
Oh, I've noticed that. Yes.
Yes.
Perhaps there'll be a new breed of people that can sleep on those things.
Well, yeah, but it's.
Maybe you could buy something to bridge,
that's
to
an
bridge it,
Yeah.
to bridge the hump.
Well, that's an informal settlement. A formal settlement. That would be a formal settlement. Would be the bench with the armrest in the middle that you can't lie down on, and the informal settlement would be the ones that have got just the normal benches, I suppose.
Well, in Roehampton there used to be Roehampton's quite a nice place to live, which is why the Alton estate is under threat by the evil developers. But specifically, there used to be a kind of concrete sort of seating arrangement around some trees and so on as you go down Dainby Avenue. And it was quite nice. Now, people used to sit on that. Sometimes they were drunk, sometimes they were not. But it was kind of a place where socialisation and people would bump into each other and meet. Anyway, the council, probably because they don't like drunks would be the excuse, removed all those things. So people can't sit there anymore. No, I think that is just a completely wrong way.
Well, this is really interesting because
it's meant to be building communities, but it was destroying communities.
They started taking away the benches. So the places where the traditional benches were, they started taking away. We've talked about this before, but they put these benches in the middle of on these pavements where you don't want to sit, But this is the whole thing about it. It all looks like a toy town, and I just think that these remote authorities that are doing it,
Well, they're not doing it; they're promoting it. Or you mean the council?
Well, they are doing it because it's everywhere. These plans are these things I'm reading out.
It's a kind of blueprint.
Plans.
It's a blueprint. Yeah.
Absolutely, but inclusive and sustainable economic growth with full and productive employment. Where full and productive employment? I don't think that's part of it, is it?
Look, the north of England is 0 hours contract. And what do they mean by sustainable development? Does it mean?
No, they're saying sustainable economic growth, but the thing is, under this plan, there can't be growth because there's no sustainable economy. They're saying employment and decent work for all. Well, what they're talking about is the voluntary sector. Basically, when you look,
we should reopen coal mines. That's what I would say.
Well, yes,
sustainably, of course. I.e., we can carry on getting the coal out.
But
they don't mean that, of course.
They want to have productive, prosperous and fulfilling lives for everybody. Now, under that,
you can have clean coal.
There's no way of defining what a productive life is. You see, the thing is that if someone says, I want you to have a productive and fulfilling life, I would say, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, because my idea of fulfilling might be different from yours, you see. I mean, this is the whole point. I mean,
got to have an English breakfast every day.
God, you're so full of hate, aren't you?
I don't like bacon and
I'm joking
and sausage,
because this is the whole point. We've
some
got
people live on.
We got the thing. I don't. That's. You might be vulnerable to extremism. Are you a far right nationalist? Do you have an English breakfast every day?
No, I don't. Honest, I don't have any breakfast. Honest.
We have to laugh at this stuff because it is so absurd. But that was the really funny thing a few weeks ago. English breakfast by these lobbyists like Hope Not Hate. We could put hate on a plate. The English breakfast, the far right. Would I like 2 far rights, please?
Really? Okay.
Well, I'd have a cappuccino with it. Be international as well. Be sustainable. But yeah, we've got this talk coming up on the 16th of June, and the week after, Piers is going to be debating somebody about climate change.
That's right.
And he's not a radical, this guy Piers is debating. He's a university professor, or I don't know whether he's a professor or he's actually a lecturer. But it's going to be at the Merthyr Rising Festival in Merthyr Tydfil,
Excellent.
which is
That's
where
it.
they kind of celebrate the uprising of the workers, you see, which is a traditional thing. And South Wales has always been quite rebellious. They were very rebellious with the Chartist movement, etc. Turn of the century. And they've been shut down a lot. So the voice of Merthyr will be heard again. And we're going to be down there on the 24th. But on the 16th, you can look at that little advert I did earlier on, and it's the King Arthur pub in Glastonbury. We've got a lovely venue there, and we're going to have entertainment in the evening and 3 talks during the daytime covering all this stuff. It'd be great to see you all there. And this is the first time that I broadcast without Tony, so I hope Tony's managed to listen, because he's very busy at the moment and he's working on very important projects. And we're actually broadcasting here live from Windows Towers in North London, and it's getting better all the time. We're getting more and more people, thanks to everybody who's contacted me through the website, because this is starting to get interesting now. And there's people now saying, I'm telling everyone to listen to the show. Well, basically, it's because we've got a lot of very important information in those shows. I listen back to them. I do a lot of research for them. And some people may find that we do repeat things, but I don't think we repeat things as much as some of the alternative media do. But this is the problem.
Or you mean the mainstream media?
Well, the alternative media as well, because
Okay.
we're finding that people do tend to stick to, there's certain issues that come up that people stick to, but I tend to plough this sort of groove where I'm looking at really what's going on affecting people's lives on the ground, and then trying to bring the bigger picture of that in. And that's what I find really fascinating about it, that people are getting it. And so thanks to everyone who's contacted the show, and thanks for everybody.
And get on weveraction.com as well, where these talks will be also advertised.
I was going to say that, Piers, but you preempted it.
I preempted you, sorry there.
Yeah, but it's all right. That's okay. So what we're going to do now is sign off, and we're going to see you next week, 9 to 11, winnersontheworld.net. Tell your friends and amuse your enemies, and find some useful idiots to annoy. That's it for this week, and we'll see you very soon.
Okay. Playing that music. Well done, citizen. That was sort of How many were there more listeners this time than usual?
Yes, there's a lot, because we're getting about 1,500 not all at the same time. We're getting sometimes 150 listeners. But the next day it goes on and on and on.
Captain.